been looking at Australian history. As an Australian, it would be nice to know how we got here. It's only a couple of 100 years, and when I look at the story, it collapses under its own weight. His story, as they tell us, doesn't seem to make very much sense. The Anglo history of Australia starts in the 1600s in Holland. It seems to centre around a man named Abel Jan Tasman. He rises from peasant stock to suddenly admiralty status, and then is employed by the Dutch East India Company in 1642 to travel south and look for new trade routes and resources. Basically, it's a business deal. Although he's Dutch, he takes command of a ship from a place called Batavia, which is what we now know as Jakarta in Indonesia. Indonesia is just north of Australia. He leaves and travels southwest across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar, where apparently his ships are in such bad repair they need new masts, new sails, so he spends 3 months repairing the ships. He then travels south past the Cape of Good Hope, which is renowned to be one of the worst stretches of water in the world. You can ask Tony Bullimore. He then heads east on about 42nd parallel, which lines him up directly with the base of Tasmania, where he spends weeks at sea without sighting land or fresh water until he finally arrives at the base of Tasmania, which is presumably his namesake. He stops for 2 days, gets fresh water, and leaves for New Zealand, where apparently 4 of his people met the Maoris or the Morioris or their predecessors, and 4 of them were killed. To me, that does not sound like a man who's looking for new lands. Right from the get-go, this story's got flies on it. If he left Jakarta, he could have simply travelled south-southeast, as the Dutch had fully mapped the west coast of Australia, and he was Dutch. He could have just picked up from where those charts left off, would have brought him around the south coast of Australia and to Tasmania, and it would have been fully mapped. The second obvious fallacy with this story is he went to Tasmania for 2 days. Because the weather was bad, he left. Well, after having travelled the distance he did through the oceans he travelled, a seasoned sailor like that would have been less than 24 hours for him to circumnavigate Tasmania, establishing that Tasmania was not part of the mainland of Australia and that Bass Strait existed. I don't really believe the official dogma, but I needed to show that story so that we can go back to this silly graphic here and have a look what really happened. He leaves Jakarta, travels in almost the wrong direction, and arrives at Madagascar for the East India Company. The East India Company had a sister company known as the West India Company. Whereas the East India Company dealt in goods and trade routes, the West India Company was renowned to deal with people. This whole dark history is well documented. I don't really want to get into it here. I only mention it to say that I don't think he was repairing ships at Madagascar. I think he waited where his mates at the West India Company hooked him up with people. Slaves. And I know slavery is going to trigger some people. Think of it as prisoners with jobs. And it has all sorts of euphemisms. I mean, my paternal grandparents came out here from the Irish assisted passage. On my maternal side, my grandparents came out here as 10-pound poms in indentured servitude, where they came out here and worked for their betters for 20 years to pay off their fare. That kind of slavery. He arrives at the base of Tasmania and he lets these people out. Now, regardless of where they actually came from, I think they were here as a cleanup crew. Sometime in the 1800s, there was a reset. Some catastrophe happened and this place was wiped out and covered in mud and dirt. These people came back to repair the buildings over many years. Once it was done and ready for resettlement, they started bringing out the convicts and the people under indentured servitude. The ones who actually did the cleanup, those people had to be dealt with. This is where I think the fraternal orders come in place, and lodges were established where these people were given management jobs where they were so incompetent they have heaps of assistants to actually do the work for them. We see this everywhere in the workplace today. But to be a part of this fraternal order, they had to keep a secret. And I think the secret has been buried with them, and that is that at some time we came here and repopulated this place. I don't know how the original people fit into this story, and so I've largely omitted them. But just the Anglo side of this does not make any sense, especially when you look at the animals. If none of this had a ring of truth to you, consider the later guy from the English franchise, Jim Cook, who rocks up here, apparently, in 12-metre leaky wooden boats with, and imagine this logistical nightmare, he turned up here with horses. Which brings me to all the anomalous animals that were already here that are not considered native. We have the largest population of feral donkeys, the largest population of feral camels, and they have a really pure bloodline. We have feral goats of various types. We have feral pigs. We have horses that we call brumbies that just run around wild in the southeast. We had tigers here, and somehow we just managed to kill them all. All of these things just got swept under the rug. But if you lift up the rug and look, you'll find stories like, oh yeah, they brought 2 camels out here and they got wild and partied, and now we've got a huge feral camel population. Same with the donkeys. It's the same story whenever you look under the lumpy old rug they hide shit under. I became aware of all of this nonsense story that they feed us in our 12 years of indoctrination in the government education camps when I discovered this building in Spotswood. It's the most amazing twin building, red brick. I actually saw it from Westgate Bridge. It was in the Mad Max movies also. But apparently this thing was built in the 1890s to pump shit. It's a sewer pump house. These people arrived here as convict labour and indentured servitude, and all of a sudden they're skilled masons, they've got a brickworks, they've got glassworks, they're smelting iron that never seems to rust. Also, they were so nostalgic that they built similar buildings that we find all around the world. It's almost as though there was just one culture. If you'd like to know more about these topics, I'll leave links below to people who know far more about this. People like Autodidactic channel with Campbell Purvis, or Martin Leckie, or the now infamous flip-flop brother Awa. To summarise part 1 of this video in just one statement, I'd say simply quoting Jason Breshears of Archaics would do it. How did we go from horse and buggy technology to Hadron Collider in just 200 years? And yet, at least in Australia, every 200-year period before that, there was supposedly stick, stone and bone culture. It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, I hope this lets you see that the story they tell us and what you can actually observe when you stop and look around you, none of it matches. We're living in a very, very broken system. Thanks for listening. Leave your comments below. Tell me about all the slavery and how it triggered you and how I'm an idiot. Hit like and share.